For many millennial consumers, houseplants are the gateway drug to more plants, including colorful annuals and striking perennials. Today, we'll find out from Marayah Greene what trends she's observed regarding indoor plants for both the indoor and outdoor space. Marayah is a New York-based plant stylist and consultant. She's a graduate from the Bank Street College of Education, mastering general education and literacy. What started as an Instagram account filled with plant tips and tricks has blossomed into a full-blown business. As Marayah shifted from studying formal education to cultivating green spaces through Greenpeace, she understood that the same relationships and methods she developed in the classroom influenced her introduction of houseplant care and education to new and experienced plant parents alike. Thanks for being here today, Marayah.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for having me. I'm so excited to dive into some of the trends that we've all seemed to be seeing over the past couple of months, if not pre and post pandemic. My name is Marayah Greene. I go by the plant doctor and stylist here in New York City and just about everywhere. And I'm the founder of Greenpeace, which is a plant styling and doctoring company that I founded in 2018. The main goal when I started it was to help people with their houseplants, whether it was repotting or matching people with the right plants for their space to make their plant care journey a bit easier. And over the course of 3 years now, it just sort of developed into styling. And also I've become a go-to expert for publications. And so it's been a really cool way to grow with people. I've been in publications such as the New York Times, Vogue, Good Morning America, Arc Digest, and a couple more. And again, my main mission was to make sure that plant care and styling was accessible to as many people as possible. So I found one main common theme as I was starting out, and I still find this to be the case, that there's just way too much contradictory information on Google. And you can go from one nursery or plant shop or anywhere that sells plants and get complete contradictory information about how to care for that same exact plant. And so what I wanted to do was take a look at all of the specific factors that make plant care different for everyone, and how nurseries and plant shops can make this information as accessible and easy to understand as possible. So that's what I'm hoping to dive into today. So some of the main trends we're going to cover are hanging plants and planters, how people are styling those and the ways that you can make those accessible, textured and pattern foliage. Those tend to be the ones that my clients really like, especially if they're going for a minimalist aesthetic. The plant can serve as that pop of color or that pattern that might not otherwise be in the space. The next trend we'll look at is arrangements versus larger potted plants. And then the final one will be scheduling. People tend to have a better idea of what it means to have a watering schedule as opposed to just giving your plant little bits of water every single day. So now that people are catching on and getting more accurate information about how to care for their plants, there are ways that buyers can implement these understandings into how they set up and sell their plants. So let's just start with hanging plants and planters. We're probably all familiar with the concept of the spiller, filler, and the thriller idea, where you get one of different types of plants and put them in that hanging basket and then put it maybe on your porch or your backyard, etc. However, my specialty is indoor plants. And while people absolutely love hanging planters for indoors as well, that concept doesn't really apply because you're looking at one main plant to be the star of the show. Because as we know, different houseplants have different watering needs, different lighting needs, etc. So some of the ones that I see that people really, really love right now are heartleaf philodendrons. I have one here that's gotten pretty long, pothos, for example, Hoya carnosas, and even ivies. So anything that sort of is long and trailing over time, people tend to really like having those in their windowsills or hanging from some space in their apartment. The thing that I think is really important to note, though, is planters. So the drainage hole is something that I get asked about a lot. And I'm sure if you're selling plants in nursery pots that have those holes at the bottom, well, it does have that hook at the top and it makes it look really easy to just hang in place and walk away. When it comes time to water it, you either have to take that down, take it to the sink and then water it, or you're reaching up on a ladder with a watering can and hopefully you're catching all the water that's coming out of the holes at the bottom. So one of the things that I think is important, especially from a seller's point of view, is if you are having any sort of installation or setup where people can look in the windowsill, and assess whether or not they might want a hanging planter. Having a plant that's still in the nursery pot and then putting it in a planter, a temporary planter, where you can take the plant in and out and that water can sort of be caught within the planter that it's sitting in is ideal. And that just makes for an easier way for people to care for their plants. And sizing is really important because people are starting to understand the idea that you don't actually want to pot your plant in something that's the exact same size as the original nursery pot. You want to give it about 1 inch or 2 of room in diameter so that it can grow. So while having a nice full and long hanging plant in a hanging planter is really nice, it's truly going to need to be repotted within a year or so. And so if you can set up a system where you have a smaller plant inside of a bigger planter and you're letting the person who's purchasing make that investment on their own, that's the way to go. So we'll move on to textures and pattern foliage because that seems to be a really common trend right now, or at least over the past year. Like I mentioned, the minimalist aesthetic has become extremely popular and people rely on the foliage and the patterns within the foliage to be their pop or their center within their space. So some of the common ones I'm seeing are alocasia plants, wandering Jews, calatheas, anything with any sort of texture either on the tops or bottom of the leaves. And what's interesting is people really enjoy the pops of color or different textures, but they're putting them in simple planters such as white, black, terracotta, really, really simple so that the plant can be the star of the show. And so while different planters exist, whether they're variety of colors or they're matte or they're glazed, those can serve as sort of a backdrop in letting the plant be the star of the show so that that can be the pop of green that everyone is focusing in on. And then following that, arrangements versus larger potted plants. And over the course of 3 years, I've found that people tend to fall in one of two camps, if you will. You can see here that I fall into sort of both of them. And those two camps are people are looking for really large potted plants to be their statement piece, or they're looking for smaller plants and they're getting multiple of those and making their own sort of mini indoor jungle in an arranged space. So camp one, for example, the bold pop of color coming from something like a bird of paradise, maybe that massive fiddle leaf fig that's in your dentist's office, or an elephant ear plant, for example. People that have higher ceilings, more floor space, they're looking for things that sort of serve as a piece of architecture in their home. And one of the best ways that that can be sold is if it's in a plain planter, white, black, or terracotta. So it can sort of serve as a blank slate. And you're giving the buyer or the person coming into the store the option to decide, how do I want this to be the main staple or the main piece of architecture within my home? And then the second camp is smaller tabletop surfaces, or whether it's windowsills or just a side table. And you're giving the buyer the creativity, if you will, to create their own sort of a mini arrangement. So textured planters or different colored planters with different patterns are the best way to do this. So for example, while this might not look like a classic terracotta, it is made out of a clay and it has these sort of white speckles on them. And so while this looks like a standard classic shaped pot, you can then pair it with something like maybe a propagation of a pothos, for example, and something that's sort of funky and different shaped. So you're giving people the option to create something that they wouldn't otherwise find if it's just in a simple nursery pot. So you can sort of think of it as selling the dream when you go into a store and you see that window display. If you're automatically playing with layers and height and color, you're giving people access to something they wouldn't otherwise think to put together. And so the last sort of big component here is scheduling is key. People are catching on to the idea that plants have different needs. They vary in height, color, and we're starting to also understand that all of our windows are facing a different way. And so while you might Google the plant care for Monstera deliciosa, for example, you might get conflicting information, but the one thing that none of these sources take into account is that everyone's window is facing a different way and they're getting different intensity and amounts of light. So the thing I've been seeing the most over the past 3 years is plant shops and nurseries are selling and arranging their plants in different ways. And this is all about knowing your audience, of course. The most common and I find the most helpful way to display plants within a space is organizing them based on either type, the need, or the style. So we can dive into that a bit deeper. Type of plant, maybe all of your philodendrons are in one corner. And while some of them might be long and viney, others of them might have fuller leaves and might grow nice and tall. The other way that you can style is based on needs. So, and I would recommend this way of selling because that's the way that most people are starting to understand their plants and the ones that they can care for. And so by need means how often does this plant need water? So while you might have a succulent and another sort of philodendron that they both happen to need water once every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how much light they're getting, you can put those together and have people understand the idea that this is a plant that you can care for because they're on a similar schedule. So that's just one way to make plants a bit more accessible and understanding plant care. And then finally, style. Maybe it's you're putting all of your long vining plants together, all of your massive, tall, banana-shaped leaves together, or you're putting all of your cacti and succulents together. So when you're considering displays and ways to reach an audience to make things accessible, you want to sort of consider the way that they would take this plant home, start designing it on their own, and you can sell the dream within your store on a display so that they already have an idea of how to do that. So those are the main trends and patterns that I've seen over the past couple of years. And I hope that these make buying and make plants accessible for everyone as you continue to figure out which plants are sort of in the trends right now and which ones people are not necessarily drawn to anymore. Because there are ways that you can make them more accessible and fun by putting them in a cool planter, maybe arranging by different heights, or just making them, locating them differently within a store to make them accessible to different people. So thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to answering your questions.